Thank you, Dot. Hello everyone. As we are waiting for a couple of more people to join in, just start with just welcoming everybody to today's web cafe. This web cafe series is focusing on the hidden harms in the West Midlands. We are pleased to be partnering with organizations and survivors based in the West Midlands to look at harmful practices affecting communities in this area, sharing learnings around support, best practices, and prevention. This series is funded by the West Midland PCC. Today we have expert Gem Wilkins-Ross, who will be talking to us about spiritual abuse within the church. Welcome, Gem. Gem has a career of over a decade of working with both survivors and perpetrators of domestic abuse and sexual violence, specializing in the responses and impact of trauma. She has lectured in criminology and delivered trainings on how to most effectively work with survivors of abuse. Gem joined Safe Spaces in 2022 and has grown with the service, raising awareness of spiritual abuse and its impact, advocating for survivors and encouraging awareness and understanding within the church community. All the topics, everything that is just quite close to me personally as well. So welcome, Gem, and over to you.
Thank you so much, and for that lovely introduction. I'm sending that to my mum immediately. So I will just share my screen. I'm not used to Zoom, so bear with. Oh, I think I've done it. Fantastic. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So firstly, thank you for having me here today, and for giving me this platform to be able to speak about spiritual abuse. It's something that I feel people are becoming more aware of, but there is still certainly a way to go in helping people's understanding of it. So I really appreciate this platform and everybody's engagement today. So thank you. Before we get into the agenda, I also just want to drop a quick content warning. There will be some discussion around domestic abuse, sexual violence. So if you do feel that that is impacting you in a negative way, then please do feel free to just step back, go and get a drink if you need to, check in with your support network. Just make sure that you're looking after yourself. So the agenda today. So I just wanted to talk briefly about Safe Spaces, who I work for, who we are, what we do, um, to sort of, so you can understand my credentials. And also in case there's anyone here personally or professionally that was interested in making a referral to the service. We're going to look at what spiritual abuse actually is, look at the definitions of it, how it can present itself, the impacts of it, and then Leah and I will be having a discussion before some Q&A from anyone if you want to contribute, but that's not mandatory. Okay, so Safe Spaces. Now, it is still really in its infancy. It was formed by the Anglican and the Catholic churches of England and Wales and was launched in 2020, largely in response to the ICSA, the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. It was a pilot scheme which ran until 2022, which was when I joined, and it has been contracted by First Light since 2023. Now, one of the barriers I would say that we face with people coming into the service is whether we are independent of the church. I can confirm we are. Now, I can completely appreciate people's hesitation about this, but we do have an independent board. So there are Wales and the Catholic Church on these boards, but there is also safeguarding representatives and survivors of church abuse on these boards too. And we also have an advisory board, which then help to inform the board and therefore us about what our remit is and how we can most effectively support people. So we are independent of the church, and that is, again, that can be a barrier with people entering the service. And that's something that we work with on an individual basis. So, to be eligible for safe spaces, you must be over 18, and the abuse needed to have been perpetrated by the Church of England, the Church of Wales, or the Catholic Church. There are, of course, other denominations, and we do signpost to other organisations that can support these people, but that is the remit that we work within. It can be non-recent abuse, current, and you don't have to have disclosed to the diocese or to the police before coming to us. We are free and independent, and whilst all our staff are ISFA trained, our role is to advocate. So we are advocates. We found as the service progressed that the need for advocacy really became the main issue. So things like facilitating communication with diocese, things like funding or finding funding for therapy, emotional support, listening service, all of those sorts of things. So whilst we are all ISFA trained, we provide more of an advocacy service. And the initial referral can come through our helpline. So we have an out of hours helpline that runs 7 days a week, and you're then allocated to an advocate for ongoing support, whatever that may look like. If you have any questions about safe spaces that I haven't answered, please just make a note, and I would welcome any questions about this at the end. I realise it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I really want to get into the meat. So, what is spiritual abuse? So it's important just to note that spiritual abuse is not recognised in law as its own offence. So whilst there is much more of an awareness of it, that's more within society, it's not within law. Rather, it comes under the umbrella of emotional and psychological abuse. So if we were looking for the definition of spiritual abuse, it is characterized by a systematic pattern of coercive and controlling behavior within a religious context. So what does spiritual abuse look like? Now, when I said that it comes kind of under the umbrella of psychological and emotional abuse, this is what I mean, because as you can see, there is quite a crossover between behaviors that you would find normally within psychological and emotional, but also some very specific things that you would find just within spiritual abuse. So manipulation, exploitation, censorship of decision-making, requirements for secrecy and silence, coercion to conform. Now, all of those things we can attest to emotional, psychological, and spiritual. However, there are very specific behaviors in regards to spiritual abuse. So, control through the use of sacred texts or teaching, requirement of obedience to the abuser, and the suggestion that the abuser has a divine position. So, one particular case that I can relate to these as a sort of example is we had a call from somebody. It was actually from the husband, not the woman herself. It was from the husband, and he had called us because he was unsure whether his wife was being abused by the priest. They were Catholic, and as we know, Catholic priests have taken a vow of celibacy. It transpired that the priest had been telling this man's wife that he had to have sex with her to ensure that he didn't break his vow of celibacy, that she was the chosen one. She had this divine duty to perform to help him in his mission within the church. The husband wasn't aware that this was even abuse. The wife wasn't aware that she was being abused, because if we look at these behaviors, manipulation and exploitation, absolutely. She was being manipulated and exploited to engage in this because of the pressure and the guilt and the wanting to please the priest and to please God. Censorship of decision making. She wasn't in a position to make informed choices about her own actions and her own decisions. Requirements for secrecy and silence. The priest, of course, did not want her disclosing this information to anybody else because he was aware of what his actions were. Coercion to conform. So, I need you to do this. I need you to help me. You can't be a proper Catholic if you don't help me. Control through the use of sacred texts and teachings, with the vow of celibacy, not wanting to break that vow. Requirement of obedience to the abuser, who was in a position of authority as far as she was concerned. And the suggestion that the abuser has a divine position, being a priest, being a representative of the Catholic Church. So I'm using that as an example where we can attest all of these behaviors and all of these actions to spiritual abuse, but how they do extend into other forms of abuse as well. So the impact of spiritual abuse. Now, I am mindful of time here, so I will try and sort of collectively address these as best I can. But when we speak about spiritual abuse, we are speaking about the core of someone. We are speaking about their faith, about their beliefs, about their soul, and having the impact of spiritual abuse make them question their faith. So who they are. There's links to community and family that they may not feel they can disclose this abuse because they would be ostracized, because their families would disown them. There's issues such as abandonment. They feel that God has abandoned them because why would he let that happen to them? You know, is this in his plan? And they start questioning their own faith. Things like the source of abuse and the source of solace are often one and the same. So you're questioning why God has allowed this to happen, but also God is the same place that you go for that comfort, and it really creates a disconnect. What happens when that's there? Where do you go? And these impacts can be felt all across church abuses. There's also, just going back to the top point, personal well-being versus community well-being. We know that church is an integral part of community. And to go and to put yourself above your community is not something that they feel that they can do. They don't want to disclose this. They don't want to put the clergy member at risk of being thought about detrimentally or losing his position. So there are a myriad of impacts that spiritual abuse can have on someone. I wanted to touch briefly on conversion therapy, which I understand is a term we're familiar with. And it is another kind of spiritual abuse. It's a type of spiritual abuse that uses religion to suppress or change a person's sexuality or gender identity, sorry. So methods can include things such as exorcisms, food deprivation, physical violence. What we have found within our casework is that it tends to occur more covertly. So using some of the presentations of spiritual abuse that we've spoken about, but much more covertly than, you know, such exorcisms and physical violence. Now, we know that that happens and we don't minimize that in any way. But what we find is that when it's used covertly, people are much less certain of whether abuse, spiritual abuse, has taken place. So a case study that we've had recently, there was a woman, so she's in her mid-20s when she came to us, so she's still very young. She attended a Catholic girls' school and confided about her sexuality in a teacher there when she was about 12. who then disclosed this without consent to the school chaplain. There were no safeguarding issues. There was nothing that needed to be disclosed elsewhere. The chaplain and the teacher then met with her alone after school and offered her counselling that they were unqualified to give. They explicitly told her that her feelings were unhealthy, that they weren't normal. And this is the one that we come up against a lot. They stated that they would pray for her. She hadn't asked for counselling. She hadn't asked for anybody to pray for her. She had simply tried to disclose what was a difficult subject to speak about, particularly at that age when things can be confusing. She just wanted to be able to discuss it safely. She didn't need counselling and she didn't need them to pray for her. So when we spoke about it, she was unsure whether it had been abuse, because she said, well, it was just counselling. They just suggested counselling. They just suggested that they pray for me. However, if we link back to some of the behaviours and the presentations of spiritual abuse, things come up. So, for example, exploitation and manipulation. In telling her that it was unhealthy and not normal, it made her feel that she was different, that she was other, that she was abnormal, that there was something wrong with her. In terms of censorship of decision making, so disclosing personal information without her consent and without any kind of issue of safeguarding, that wasn't something that ever needed to be disclosed to anybody else. I'm so sorry. Coercion to conform, so being pressured to attend counselling, weren't qualified to give. And control using sacred texts and teaching, so telling her that they would pray for her. Now, one of the things that we do find in this is, if our clients often say to us, they said that they'd pray for me, but they don't want them to pray for them because that's not something that they're giving them permission for. Now, if that's something that they wanted to go away and do personally, that is their prerogative. But actively saying that we will pray for you because of A, B, and C implies that there is a reason that that person needs prayer. And in this case, it was because she had disclosed her sexuality. So when we talk about covert sort of spiritual abuse in terms of conversion therapy, these are the issues that we're seeing. And people don't know. People aren't aware that they've been abused. And we see this a lot with people, particularly coming to us, safe spaces, that aren't sure whether what's happened to them has been abuse, because the church is their sacred place. It's their comfort. It's their solace. So the dissonance between something that has always been a place of comfort to them to then hurting them is something that's really, really difficult for them to navigate. And that's one of the things that us as advocates are able to support them with and talk through with them. I absolutely zoomed through that, excuse the pun. Am I still sharing my screen?
Yes, your screen is still full.
So there we go. Yeah, I enjoyed that. I zoomed through that. Didn't even realize I made a pun. But hopefully that has given you a bit of an insight to some of the issues that are around spiritual abuse, how they present themselves, the impact of it, and a lot of the cases that we're seeing.
That was fantastic, Gemma. Thank you. I was not just listening, I was also paying attention to your presentation, and there were a lot of elements that reached out to me personally, being a survivor of spiritual abuse myself, coming from the queer community, also working in the mental health field. I have a lot of intersectionalities that play out for me when the topic of spirituality or any kind of faith-based abuse is brought up. First, I would like to thank you again for your presentation, which is quite lovely. The one question that kept popping up while you were going through it was related to the case that you discussed about the husband not being very abused in its first place.
Sorry, you dropped out a little bit then. Sorry.
Yes, I'll repeat myself. I was paying attention to the case, and there were certain elements that stood out to me with regards to identifying
Mhm.
how spiritual abuse takes its form, how does it present itself, and how the husband who reached out to you was not aware if this particular thing could be even considered as abuse. So, if you could throw some light on how this presents itself in someone who is actively going through abuse.
I think there are, again, a lot of crossovers. So, for example, his wife, she was expressing to him, and it's really great that she had that space to disclose to him and talk to him about how she was feeling. um, she became very disillusioned with her faith. So she was connected to it, but not in the way that she was. For example, she wasn't attending church, not just because the priest was there, because he wasn't there all the time, but she was not attending church. She would, express doubt with her faith. She wasn't praying as if so her routine in terms of her faith had very much changed, which is when he started to pick up on something being wrong. And as I say, there were signs she was depressed, sort of not sleeping well, those sorts of things as well, which go along with spiritual abuse. Kind of as I mentioned, it does kind of come under that umbrella, and some of the impacts do as well. But there are things that were very specific to spiritual abuse, and in that case, it was things like that that he had noticed.
So, as people who are reaching out to you
Mhm.
in doubt of maybe if this is considered abuse or if this is something even just not feeling right, what are the things that they see within themselves apart from the faith as well? Because I would say, from my own end, when I started questioning if this was abuse in its first place, I remember having a lot of questions
Mm.
and just having so many questions without any answers. And questions in itself was something that was discouraged very heavily. So, is there something other than just the faith being centric to it, anything that they could identify within themselves, which does not feel right, does not sit right with them?
I suppose it's hard to say collectively because everybody is individual. What I would say is that we as a service are at least able to be a sounding board for them. And very often what we find is that giving them the opportunity and that space to speak, they kind of almost answer them their own questions. So by giving them that space, they kind of think, oh, actually, hang on. And, it's not our role to direct anyone to say, this is how you feel. This is we certainly, obviously, when there are safeguarding issues, very much, that's not okay. But I would say it's very much an individual experience. And there's just from my, I mean, obviously you have your experience, but I would say it's not a one size fits all.
Agree, I definitely agree. You mentioned spaces,
Mm,
that just directly leads me to another question that I had in mind. As someone who is maybe questioning faith because of past abuse, or is just not in good terms with what they would like to know about themselves and their relationship with their religion or spirituality, um, the infrastructure and the structure of this church both become very threatening to them.
yeah.
What are some safe spaces or external to the church where people can gather as a community to practice their faith, to just inquire about each other? And this is not just for people who have faced abuse, but also people who are abandoned, maybe queer communities trying to come and formulate their faith. What are some spaces that could be external from the structure and infrastructure of the church that you could
Well, this
think?
is a question that we've been asking too. Um,
Mhm.
we're a remote service, which is good in one way because it means we can access lots of people, we can reach them, but not so great in another way because we are then very limited. In an ideal world, there would be a safe spaces in every diocese, and we'd be able to provide that physical space away from the church. At the moment, that's not something we're able to do. We do find that every diocese is different, and there are spaces in some geographical locations where they are able to offer that, and so people can go there. That's not always the case. I would suggest, with safe spaces specifically, what we have started is a peer group. Now, of course, it's remote, sorry. Um, but we have a group of survivors who meet together. I facilitate it actually with my colleague Sarah. It runs every 2 weeks from 10 till half 11. We do check-ins, check-outs, and it enables people who have been through a situation I feel that is very nuanced, that not a lot of people can understand the nuances of. So even when we work with survivors who are accessing counselling of any description, talking therapy, EMDR, etc., they are still missing that spiritual element of it because there's that lack of understanding. So having this space where they can talk through their own experiences, their feelings, their coping mechanisms has proved to be really valuable for them. And we've had people that in the same group at two ends of the spectrum. So, for example, we've had someone that's just starting to go through the criminal justice process. That's not mandatory to come to us, by the way. And then we've also got someone who's gone through the end of it and the perpetrator has been sentenced and they're in jail. And seeing the dynamic between those people being able to give each other advice and say, oh, I know what you mean. And those were my feelings. And I went through that too. It's I'm really it's one of the things I'm proudest of in safe spaces.
That's fantastic. That's really good to hear, especially the peer communities coming together. And I know having a third space, coming from a country like mine as well, having a third space is not something that is very commonly known of,
Yeah,
something not even thought of in certain circumstances. So having something online in a remote facilitation does work and does bring communities closer. Um, I had another question with intersectionalities coming into play with,
yeah,
the forms of abuse that spiritual abuse could aid, facilitate itself into. There is, of course, domestic violence. There's coercion that is caused due to religion, keeping religion as a main center to it all. Um, is there um, any way in which people can also speak about the other forms of violences that have taken place because of spiritual violence? Like
absolutely. Yeah, 100%. So just cheekily charging my laptop up there, sorry. Yes, absolutely. So I think one of the things that I've established, if I'm wrong, correct me, please, is that whatever the type of abuse that was perpetrated, whether it was physical, sexual, financial, there is always, when it's from the church, always an element of spiritual abuse in that. And
yes,
it's so multifaceted because, and this isn't to minimize anything, I just want to make that very clear. But when you're dealing with spiritual abuse, you're working with the abuse itself, so the sexual violence, for example, but then you're also dealing with the spiritual element of that. So we, in that sense, and I hope this is answering the question, we don't separate them. We know that spiritual abuse exists on its own,
yeah.
but we also know it is intertwined with any kind of abuse that comes directly from the church.
Yes, yeah, that does answer my question. Because sometimes what happens is in spaces like such, or at least from my experience and what I've heard from my own um, field of work, there's a movement for othering the types of abuse that you go through. So there would be space maybe only for this things that have been perpetuated from a spiritual angle. So the things about having gone through domestic violence, sexual violence, or financial violence would be then considered secondary, or maybe it could be vice versa sometimes. It could be that, oh no, there was an element of domestic violence, so let's only focus on that. And I've known from our MHP, from a mental health practitioner's angle as well, where certain abuses are considered um, more important to look at or to begin with, than coming on to talking about how they both were together and hand in hand. Maybe it's both different sides of the same coin. So it's good to see that there is a space where you are talking hand in hand with how spiritual abuse has impacted a physical abuse or a sexual abuse angle. So that is fantastic. I'm done with my questions on my end. So if anyone else in the audience would have any questions for Gemma here, anything that popped up in mind, or your reflections for today's cafe, podium is yours for now.